In the sweltering heart of Carthage, where the salty Mediterranean winds swept over stone temples and the scent of oil, grain, and ambition filled the air, a plan had been taking shape for years. The Punic Wars had not ended with peace, but with a pause, a breath held between storms. Carthage, bloodied but unbroken by its defeat in the First Punic War, stood vigilant, brooding over Sicily's loss and the rising arrogance of Rome. Hamilcar Barca, once a commander in that conflict, had not forgiven, nor had he forgotten. In his household, amid prayers to Baal Hammon and whispers of vengeance, he raised a son forged in the crucible of military doctrine and ancestral pride, Hannibal. Hannibal was not yet born when Carthage's fleet burned in the harbors, nor when the indemnity payments to Rome began to drain the lifeblood of the city's economy. But he inherited the bitterness as naturally as his father's features. Sworn to eternal enmity against Rome before he could understand the weight of such a vow, he was trained to think not as a soldier, but as a strategist, a leader, a symbol. From an early age, he studied terrain, tactics, and the lessons of past defeats. By the time he was a man, he had already ridden at his father's side through the dust of Hispania, commanding troops, negotiating with tribes, and building what would become the cornerstone of his great campaign. Carthage, deprived of its holdings in Sicily and Corsica, turned westward. The Iberian Peninsula, rich in silver and manpower, became the new theater of Carthaginian expansion. Under Hamilcar, and then his son-in-law Hasdrubal, a new dominion was carved, one that would stretch from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic. Hannibal, after Hasdrubal's assassination, assumed command at the age of 26, inheriting a hardened army and a dream only partially fulfilled. He was bold but meticulous, young but already a veteran of war and intrigue. He knew Carthage would not survive a second submission to Rome. If there was to be another war, it must be decisive and taken to the enemy's heart. The spark came in Saguntum, a city allied to Rome but lying south of the Ebro River, the agreed-upon limit of Carthaginian expansion. Hannibal laid siege to it with methodical precision, drawing Roman fury across the sea. The city fell after 8 months of resistance. In Rome, the Senate howled for war. In Carthage, the council wavered but ultimately endorsed its young general. The Second Punic War had begun, but Hannibal did not wait for Rome to dictate the battlefield. He envisioned an audacious march, one no general had dared before, across the Alps into the very spine of the Italian peninsula. He would not attack Sicily, nor face the Roman navy at sea. He would strike by land, through terrain considered impassable by most, dragging with him an army of over 50,000 men, cavalry, and even African war elephants. It was a gamble bordering on madness, a campaign that would define his legacy. The logistics were staggering. Supply lines would stretch thin over hundreds of miles. Enemy tribes, rough mountain paths, and sudden weather changes threatened every step. But Hannibal believed in momentum and in the power of surprise. If he could cross the Alps and descend into Italy before Rome expected it, he could rally discontented tribes, fracture alliances, and perhaps even drive a wedge between Rome and its allies. War was not just about strength. It was about movement, illusion, and will. As the late summer sun baked the Iberian hills, the army departed from New Carthage, Hannibal riding at its head. Behind him marched Iberians, Libyans, Numidian cavalry, and a handful of enormous, slow-moving elephants, each step shaking the dry earth. The Rhone lay ahead. Beyond it, the towering white peaks of the Alps loomed like silent sentinels, ancient and indifferent. Somewhere beyond them lay the fertile valleys of northern Italy, and the beginning of Rome's reckoning. The journey from New Carthage to the Rhone River was not one of haste, but of deliberate preparation. Hannibal understood that the strength of his army lay not only in its numbers, but in its cohesion, its discipline, and its capacity to adapt across regions foreign to Carthaginian tradition. He led his troops across the Iberian Peninsula with calculated precision, forging alliances, subduing resistant tribes, and securing critical passes through the mountains of the Pyrenees. The heat of late summer bore down on the columns of infantry and cavalry, while the great lumbering elephants moved slowly, their massive bodies consuming food and water at an alarming rate. Supplies were carefully rationed. Local sources were supplemented by carts loaded with dried grain, cured meats, and amphorae of oil. River crossings were treacherous and often contested, but Hannibal moved swiftly, offering clemency to cooperative towns and harsh retribution to any that resisted. As they progressed, he left behind garrisons and messages to his brother Hasdrubal, who remained in Iberia to safeguard the rear and possibly send reinforcements in the future. This was not a reckless charge. It was a grand orchestration of logistics, strategy, and psychological warfare. Crossing the Pyrenees cost Hannibal more than he anticipated. Skirmishes with hostile tribes forced him into diversions. The rugged terrain wore down his troops and beasts. Several units deserted, their courage faltering under the sheer scale of the mission. Yet Hannibal pressed on, not through punishment, but by invoking belief. His words and actions instilled in his men the conviction that this was not just a war of conquest. It was a crusade of destiny. Rome was powerful, but not invincible. He would prove it by striking at its very heart, from a direction no Roman general had ever thought possible. As the army neared the Rhone River, autumn approached. The fields of Gaul gave way to broader plains dotted with Celtic settlements. These lands were not empty. Tribes of fierce independence roamed the region, many with no particular allegiance to either Rome or Carthage. Hannibal, fluent in persuasion and generous with promises, appealed to their hatred of Roman interference. Some tribes aided his crossing, providing guides and provisions. Others, suspicious of his true intent, resisted. One such tribe, the Volsi, blocked his approach to the river. To cross the Rhone while under threat from both the front and the rear would have been disastrous. Hannibal responded with a brilliant maneuver. Sending a detachment upriver under cover of night, he built rafts in silence. As dawn broke and the Volsi faced his main force at the shore, his hidden troops launched a surprise attack from behind, driving the defenders into panic. The river crossing began immediately, an awe-inspiring feat of engineering and courage. Elephants were coaxed onto massive rafts, terrified yet obedient to their mahouts. Infantrymen swam or crossed on improvised pontoons, while cavalry forged through shallower sections. Despite strong currents and confusion, the operation succeeded. The entire army, elephants included, reached the eastern bank. Rome, hearing reports of the movement, realized too late the scale of the operation underway. Beyond the Rhone rose the first dark ridges of the Alps, their snowy summits already dusted with the early breath of winter. The Roman consul Publius Scipio had landed at Massilia, expecting to intercept Hannibal near the river. But the Carthaginian had moved too fast. Avoiding battle, Hannibal turned northward, pushing along the river's edge before veering east. The Alps, immense and pitiless, awaited him. No army of his size had ever attempted such a crossing. The terrain promised starvation, avalanches, treacherous paths, and the hostility of mountain tribes. But Hannibal saw not danger, but opportunity. If he could pass where no army had dared, he would not only outflank Rome, but shatter the myth of its invulnerability. The Alps were not an obstacle, they were a weapon, and he was ready to wield them. The air grew colder with each mile, the wind sharper as Hannibal's army turned its back to the Rhone and advanced toward the looming wall of the Alps. The plains of Gaul gave way to rougher, rising land, cut by icy rivers and narrow gorges. Hannibal rode ahead, scouting the approaches personally, trusting not in maps but in observation, instinct, and the word of local guides, many of whom were unreliable or hostile. He had committed now to the crossing. Turning back would mean admitting failure, facing encirclement, and forfeiting the campaign. Forward lay danger, but also destiny. The Alpine foothills tested the army immediately. Paths crumbled beneath the weight of baggage trains. Mountain passes twisted between cliffs and jagged rock faces. Herd animals slipped and fell into ravines. Soldiers accustomed to the heat of Africa and Iberia now marched through biting winds, bundled in cloaks and scavenged wool. Many bled from their feet, others from frostbitten hands. Rations dwindled as the army climbed higher. Hannibal enforced order through relentless discipline and iron will. But even his presence could not ease the hunger gnawing at bellies or the doubt festering in the minds of men who saw no end to the ascent. The first days brought not only hardship, but treachery. A Gallic tribe, feigning hospitality, offered safe passage through a narrow valley. Hannibal accepted, knowing duplicity was likely but calculating the risks. That night, under moonless skies, the tribesmen attacked the rearguard as it threaded through a constricted gorge. Chaos erupted. Mules bolted, supplies were lost, and several elephants panicked, trampling soldiers in the darkness. Yet Hannibal's commanders reacted swiftly, forming defensive formations, counterattacking with precision, and driving the assailants back into the hills. It was a costly engagement, but a reminder that human malice could be as deadly as nature itself. Pressing deeper into the range, the army entered regions where no vegetation grew and snow began to collect in shaded hollows. The altitude brought thin air and lethargy. Paths narrowed until only single columns could advance, forcing long halts and slow progress. The men, sleep-deprived and starving, began to murmur of death. Some deserted and vanished into the peaks. Others begged to turn back. Hannibal, sensing morale slipping, gathered his officers atop a ridge where the haze parted and the wide sweep of the valley stretched out in the distance. He pointed to it, not in hope, but in command. There lay Italy. There lay Rome's weakness. That was their goal. That was where glory would be carved. It was a vision both literal and symbolic. Seeing the plains below reignited belief. The soldiers, though wearied, renewed their march. But the Alps were not yet finished testing them. Storms rolled in, burying the paths under snow and sleet. Landslides broke roads Hannibal's engineers had barely managed to clear. They built new routes using ropes, levers, and fire-heated rock shattered with vinegar. The elephants, stubborn and confused, were coaxed onward only by the familiarity of their handlers and the scent of warmer lands ahead. Carthaginian resolve became a weapon as powerful as sword or spear. The descent would prove even more perilous than the climb. Ice-coated ledges offered no grip. Men and animals alike slipped into chasms. Wagons shattered against stone. The army, now reduced to a ghost of its former size, bled its strength into the cold earth. Yet Hannibal did not falter. He rode constantly among his troops, never cloaked in comfort, enduring the same frost and fatigue, his presence a force of will that kept the line from breaking. By the time they began to emerge from the Alpine barrier, weeks had passed. More than a third of the army had perished, but they had done what no one believed possible. They had crossed the roof of the world, carrying with them not only arms and ambition, but the ancient vengeance of Carthage. The Alps were behind them. Before them stretched the rich fields of Italy and the beating heart of the Roman Republic. The descent from the Alps did not bring immediate relief. Though the air began to warm and the snow thinned, the paths remained treacherous and steep, worn down by generations of erosion and untouched by civilized hands. Rockslides triggered by the slightest movement sent torrents of stone and ice tumbling into the narrow paths below. Pack animals, already weakened by hunger and the altitude, faltered under their burdens and fell. The elephants, majestic symbols of Hannibal's resolve, moved with painful deliberation, their feet cracked from the cold, their eyes clouded by exhaustion. Every step was measured in blood, sweat, and resolve. As the battered army descended into the upper valleys of the River Basin, it became clear how steep the price of ambition had been. Nearly half of the original force had been lost. Entire divisions of infantry were gone, swallowed by the mountains, starvation, or the swords of treacherous tribes. Supplies were critically low. The men who survived bore the marks of the crossing in their sunken cheeks, ragged clothing, and frost-scarred limbs. But they had survived, and in surviving, they had done the impossible. Rome, expecting to face Hannibal in Iberia or southern Gaul, now faced him on its own soil, behind its frontiers, where its farms fed the legions and its allies formed the backbone of its security. Word of the Carthaginian arrival spread quickly through the northern territories. The local Gallic tribes, long resentful of Roman expansion and taxes, were stirred to action. Some cautiously observed from the shadows of their fortified hills. Others came forth, curious and wary, to meet the commander who had marched elephants over the Alps. Hannibal understood the importance of this moment. His army was too weakened to challenge Rome alone. He needed allies, fighters who knew the terrain, who hated Rome more than they feared him. In speeches translated through tribal chieftains, Hannibal promised freedom, gold, and vengeance. He did not promise peace. He offered war, glorious, brutal, and necessary. The Gauls, inspired by the audacity of his arrival and the sheer endurance of his army, began to send warriors to his banner. The Carthaginian force, though diminished, began to swell once more with fresh bodies, new energy, and the fierce hatred of those who had long borne Roman oppression. Camps were built, new forges sparked, and the sick tended. The army was reborn not in comfort, but in the clarity of shared purpose. Meanwhile, Rome scrambled to react. Publius Scipio, having missed Hannibal's passage through Gaul, now rushed north to intercept the invaders before they could entrench. The Senate, shocked by reports of elephants roaming Italian valleys, mobilized multiple legions. Panic did not seize Rome, but urgency did. The invader was no longer a rumor or a distant threat. He was here, and he had brought with him not just an army, but a challenge to the very idea of Roman supremacy. Hannibal, however, did not advance recklessly. He used the terrain to his advantage, scouted local passes, and allowed his men time to recover while feeding misinformation to Roman spies. His cavalry, especially the swift and deadly Numidian riders, patrolled the region, cutting off Roman scouts, testing enemy strength, and spreading dread through the countryside. Where he moved with purpose. Where he paused, he prepared. He knew that Rome would not wait. A clash was inevitable. The first real battle of the campaign, the first test of Carthage's strategy, would soon come, not against nature, but against the legions of Rome themselves. And it would be the opening stroke in a war that would rage across the Italian peninsula for years. The Alps had taken their toll, but they had also given Hannibal the element he desired most: surprise. Now, he would begin to exploit it. The plains of northern Italy lay stretched beneath gray skies and chilled by the approach of winter. The rivers that veined the landscape flowed swift and deep, their banks lined with brittle grass and scattered settlements. It was in this setting, near the confluence of the Ticinus and the Po, that Hannibal prepared for his first confrontation with the Roman legions. His troops, though worn by the Alpine ordeal, now moved with renewed confidence. The alliance with Gallic tribes had borne fruit, adding thousands of warriors to his ranks and creating a network of local support. Roman roads that once carried taxes and troops now carried rumors of the Carthaginian ghost who had descended from the mountains. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, having sailed to Massilia and then marched north, found himself behind events. His attempt to intercept Hannibal at the Rhone had failed. Now, upon receiving word of the Carthaginian descent into the Po Valley, he moved swiftly to confront the invaders and protect the loyal northern colonies. With a small contingent of cavalry and light infantry, Scipio crossed the Po, seeking to probe Hannibal's position and intentions. He underestimated the speed with which his opponent could mobilize and the skill with which he could deploy cavalry. Hannibal chose the open plain near the Ticinus River for the confrontation. It was ground well suited to mounted combat, a domain in which his Numidian and Iberian cavalry excelled. He placed his heavy cavalry in the center and his lighter, more agile riders on the flanks, blending Carthaginian discipline with the aggressive, fluid tactics of his North African allies. As Scipio's cavalry advanced, Hannibal gave the signal. The two forces met in a thunderous clash, lances breaking, horses rearing, riders shouting over the roar of battle. Hannibal's cavalry, though smaller in number, outmaneuvered the Romans with superior coordination. The Numidians, riding in loose formations, harassed the Roman flanks, drawing them apart and exposing their center. The Iberians and heavy Carthaginian riders then struck with devastating precision, overwhelming the Roman horsemen and forcing a retreat. Scipio himself was wounded in the melee, narrowly escaping capture through the bravery of his son, also named Publius, who would later be known as Scipio Africanus. The Roman detachment fell back in disorder, rejoining the main force near Placentia. Hannibal did not pursue immediately. Instead, he let the victory resonate. He had blooded Roman forces on Italian soil, and in doing so, shattered the illusion of Roman invulnerability. News of the battle spread quickly, and the psychological impact was immense. More Gallic tribes, emboldened by the Roman setback, defected to Hannibal's cause. Supplies, men, and intelligence flowed into his camps. The landscape around him became more familiar, more accommodating. No longer an invader in hostile terrain, Hannibal began to look less like a foreign general and more like a liberator to the disenfranchised peoples of the north. His understanding of politics proved as valuable as his mastery of war. The Roman Senate responded with grim resolve. A second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was ordered north from Sicily with another army to reinforce Scipio. Rome did not accept defeat, nor did it tolerate threats within its borders. It prepared to crush Hannibal with overwhelming force, confident that its discipline, resources, and experience would ultimately triumph. But Hannibal had anticipated this reaction. He had studied the Roman mind and its habits. He did not intend to challenge Rome through siege or attrition. He would dismantle its alliances, defeat its armies piecemeal, and demonstrate, again and again, that even Rome could bleed. The Ticinus had been a skirmish, but it was the opening movement in a campaign of psychological and strategic warfare. Winter approached. Another river, the Trebia, would soon run red with battle, and Hannibal would be ready. Winter settled over the Po Valley with a cold, damp grip. The skies hung low with clouds, and the once dry plains became sodden with rain and frost. Rivers swelled with runoff from the Alpine peaks, their muddy currents swallowing the landscape's edges and turning fields into bogs. The Roman army, reinforced by the arrival of Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, now boasted nearly 40,000 men, infantry, cavalry, and auxiliary troops, stationed near the town of Placentia. Confidence surged through the Roman ranks. They had gathered their strength, and they sought to deliver a decisive blow. Sempronius, hot-tempered and eager for glory, pushed for immediate engagement. His co-consul, Scipio, still recovering from his wounds, urged caution, advocating delay until the full army could be better supplied and the season improved. But Hannibal, always one step ahead, recognized the discord and moved to exploit it. He needed another victory, not just to weaken Rome's armies, but to further draw Italian allies away from the Republic. He would choose the time, the place, and the conditions. South of the Po, near the Trebia River, Hannibal prepared the perfect ambush. He understood that a general who allowed himself to be provoked could be led into ruin. Days before the planned confrontation, he sent his brother Mago with a picked force of 2,000 infantry and cavalry to lie in wait behind a low ridge near the riverbank, hidden by frost-covered vegetation and early morning mist. Their orders were simple: remain unseen, wait for the signal, then strike the enemy's rear. The rest of the Carthaginian army camped on the far side of the Trebia, cold, wet, and undernourished. Hannibal kept them ready but appeared unprepared, tempting the Romans into a premature assault. He sent his Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman foragers and bait Sempronius into a rash decision. The bait worked. Burning with anger and confidence, Sempronius ordered his full army to cross the freezing Trebia at dawn, without breakfast, with cold rain soaking their tunics and armor, and with the river swelling at their thighs. On the opposite bank, Hannibal's men waited dry, fed, and in formation. He had placed his Libyan and Iberian infantry in the center, flanked by Gauls and his reliable cavalry wings. The elephants, few in number but terrifying in sight, stood at the ready to charge. As the Romans emerged from the river, chilled and disordered, Hannibal ordered the attack. The engagement began with brutal intensity. Roman legions advanced in their dense formations, driving against Hannibal's center. For a moment, it seemed their sheer weight might succeed. But the cold had sapped their strength, and the enemy they faced was not a disorganized horde but a battle-hardened army trained for precisely this moment. The Carthaginian flanks closed inward. The Numidian cavalry swarmed around the Roman horse, driving them from the field. Then, at the perfect moment, Mago's hidden force emerged from behind and struck the Roman rear. Caught on all sides, the Roman army began to collapse. Panic spread. Soldiers tried to retreat across the icy river, only to be trampled or drowned. Thousands were cut down, the rest captured or scattered. Only a remnant, led by a disciplined Roman corps, managed to break free and withdraw to safety. Hannibal had achieved more than a battlefield victory. He had humiliated the Roman war machine in the heart of Italy. The Trebia became a symbol of his genius, a symphony of provocation, preparation, and precise execution. More Gallic tribes now openly declared for Carthage. Roman prestige cracked, and its Senate, faced with another catastrophic loss, turned to its last hope: to stall, to regroup, and to survive. But Hannibal was not yet finished. As winter deepened, he moved southward with determination. The next campaign would not take place on the open plains, but in the mountain passes and ravines of Etruria. His eyes now turned to another trap, one that would shake the Roman Republic even deeper at its core. Winter loosened its grip upon the land, and the valleys of Etruria awakened in a haze of mist and thaw. Streams swelled with meltwater, flooding roads and choking paths with mud. Trees stood stripped and skeletal, while towns shuddered themselves against rumors of the Carthaginian advance. Hannibal, leaving the bloodied fields of the Po Valley behind, turned southward in a calculated maneuver designed to draw Rome further from its strategic strongholds and into unfamiliar, vulnerable territory. He did not march as a raider, burning fields and fleeing the legions. He marched with purpose, always measuring terrain, climate, and enemy intention like variables in a grand equation. The Roman response came under the command of Gaius Flaminius, a man whose energy and populist fire had earned him the consulship, but whose pride made him predictable. Eager to erase the disgrace of the Trebia and restore Rome's reputation, Flaminius hastened north from Arretium, raising a force of approximately 30,000 men. His orders were clear: intercept Hannibal and prevent his march on central Italy. But his movements betrayed a hunger for personal glory. He pursued his enemy without full reconnaissance, without waiting for reinforcements, and without caution. Hannibal recognized this impulsiveness immediately. Moving eastward along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, he found the perfect killing ground. The road there ran through a narrow defile, hemmed in on one side by the rising slopes of forested hills and on the other by the water's edge. Visibility was limited, and the land offered natural concealment for entire divisions. Here, Hannibal prepared his masterpiece. Before dawn, under the cover of thick fog rolling off the lake, he arranged his forces in silence. Gallic and African infantry were hidden on the hills overlooking the pass, their shields wrapped and weapons muffled. Light troops and cavalry waited at the far end of the road, poised to block any retreat. The path through the defile remained deceptively open, inviting, and unguarded. All was set. The trap was not only physical, but psychological. As Flaminius led his column into the valley at first light, the mist still clung to the ground in dense sheets. The Roman soldiers, unaware of their peril, marched in a long, disorganized line, hemmed in by the terrain. They saw no sign of the enemy, only the road before them. Hannibal waited. Not until the bulk of the Roman force had entered the defile did he give the signal. Horns sounded from the hills. Shouts and war cries echoed through the mist like thunder. Then the attack began. From the ridges above, Hannibal's infantry surged downward in waves. The Romans, caught in the narrow valley and unable to form ranks, were struck in the flank and rear. Panic spread instantly. Flaminius, mounted and shouting commands that vanished into the chaos, could not rally his men. The fog, so often a shield for armies, now became a coffin, isolating units, confusing orders, and magnifying the terror. Carthaginian cavalry blocked the road ahead, while slingers and javelin men rained death from above. The Roman army, trapped between lake and hill, disintegrated. Some soldiers drowned trying to escape through the shallow waters. Others were cut down as they fled blindly. Flaminius himself was struck from his horse and killed amidst the melee, his body lost in the confusion. By mid-morning, the fighting was over. More than 15,000 Romans lay dead. Thousands more were captured. It was not a battle. It was an annihilation. With the ambush at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal achieved one of the most decisive tactical victories in military history. Rome, stunned by the scale and swiftness of the disaster, entered a period of crisis. The psychological blow was as significant as the physical loss. Hannibal had not only shattered another Roman army, he had done so without offering a traditional battle, bypassing strength through superior positioning, timing, and understanding of terrain. The Italian heartland now stood wide and trembling. But Hannibal did not march on Rome. He knew the city would not fall to terror alone. Not yet. His strategy was not one of siege. It was one of attrition and destabilization. The next phase required patience, persuasion, and yet another deadly lure. and it would soon lead both Rome and Carthage to the fields of Cannae. The disaster at Lake Trasimene sent shockwaves through the Republic. For the second time in a year, a Roman army had been obliterated, its consul slain, its formation shattered, and its soldiers buried under foreign steel on Italian soil. Panic seized the Senate and the city. Religious ceremonies multiplied, augurs scoured the heavens for omens, and Vestal virgins prayed for the city's deliverance. Yet the Senate did not collapse into inaction. Amid the fear, it turned to the old traditions, electing a dictator to face the existential threat. Into this role stepped Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man whose instincts diverged sharply from the Roman ideal of direct confrontation. Fabius understood what few others dared to voice aloud. Hannibal could not be defeated through conventional means. His genius lay not in brute force alone, but in his ability to manipulate terrain, tempo, and the minds of his opponents. So Fabius adopted a strategy later scorned but tragically prescient: delay, containment, and avoidance. He would harass Hannibal's flanks, cut off his foragers, destroy his supply lines, and wear him down without engaging in a pitched battle. This Fabian strategy, while unpopular, offered Rome its only chance at survival. Hannibal, meanwhile, moved as he pleased through southern Italy. His army, replenished with Gallic and Italic allies, marched from region to region, not conquering, but unbinding the ties that held the Roman alliance system together. He spared towns that surrendered and punished those that resisted, always emphasizing that his war was against Rome, not Italy. His psychological warfare deepened with every step. Slaves were freed, local leaders bribed or protected, and the message of Carthaginian liberation broadcast across the peninsula. In Apulia, Campania, and Samnium, cities wavered in loyalty. Some defected, while others hedged, watching the tides of power. Hannibal maintained his mobility and intelligence through his cavalry, especially the Numidian squadrons, who outran and outmaneuvered Roman scouts with unnerving ease. The Romans, used to dictating the terms of war, now found themselves reacting, always one step behind. The Senate, though united in fear, grew restless under Fabius' passive tactics. His delays, while prudent, appeared weak to a public thirsting for retribution. As Fabius' temporary dictatorship ended and command passed to new consuls, Rome reverted to type. In 216 BCE, it raised the largest army it had ever assembled, over 80,000 men, drawn from citizens, allies, and every corner of the Republic. This massive force was entrusted to the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Their goal was simple and absolute: destroy Hannibal. They marched south into Apulia, toward the town of Cannae, where Hannibal had seized a Roman grain depot and established a strong defensive position along the Aufidus River. Hannibal recognized the significance of the moment. The Romans had given him exactly what he wanted: a great army in open terrain, led by divided leadership and overconfidence. He had chosen Cannae not by accident, but as a stage for the culmination of his strategy. The battlefield was flat, open, and wide, ideal for maneuvering cavalry and exploiting weakness. The heat of summer baked the land, drying the fields into hard-packed earth. Dust would rise quickly, clouding vision and choking movement. As the Roman army approached, Hannibal prepared with calm deliberation. He studied the flow of wind and dust, the slant of the river, and the psychological state of his enemies. His line of battle was formed not with brute strength, but with cunning intent, placing his weakest troops at the center, tempting the Romans to believe in the illusion of breakthrough. His cavalry, stronger and more agile, would be the hammer to swing behind. The stage was set for the most audacious tactical maneuver of the ancient world. The coming battle at Cannae would not be another ambush or retreat. It would be a confrontation on Rome's terms, but fought on Hannibal's design. Victory would require perfect timing, unwavering discipline, and the orchestration of every strength Carthage could bring to bear. In the dry morning wind of Apulia, with the eyes of history upon them, the fate of nations moved toward a single point of collision. The early morning of August 2nd, 216 BCE, dawned hot and windless across the parched plains of Cannae. Dust already clung to skin and armor as Hannibal arranged his army with the precision of a sculptor working in stone. The sun rose behind the Carthaginian lines, casting light directly into the Roman eyes. The ground between the two forces lay flat, dry, and unobstructed, perfect for visibility, disastrous for entrapment, unless one understood how to manipulate time and space within an open battlefield. The Roman force, nearly 90,000 strong, stretched in a deep column designed to break through the center by sheer mass. Their formation was unyielding and conventional. Dense infantry ranks positioned to drive forward, flanked by cavalry on either side. The Carthaginian army, half its size, was arranged in a crescent, with the bulge of the arc facing forward. In the center stood Hannibal's Iberian and Gallic infantry, lighter and less equipped than their Roman counterparts. Flanking them were the seasoned Libyan heavy infantry, angled slightly backward, hidden by distance and the curvature of the formation. His cavalry, led by Hasdrubal and Maharbal, formed the wings, light on the left, heavy on the right. The battle began with a thunderous advance of the Roman legions. They surged forward, confident, their deep columns designed to smash through enemy lines like a spear. Hannibal's central infantry gave ground slowly, deliberately falling back in a controlled retreat. It was not disorder, but choreography. The crescent folded inward under the Roman pressure, drawing them further into the trap. Roman commanders believed the Carthaginian center was collapsing. Encouraged, they pushed harder, deeper, compressing their own ranks in the narrow pocket that formed as the enemy flanks bent. Meanwhile, on the wings, the Carthaginian cavalry struck. On the left, the Numidian horsemen engaged the Roman allied cavalry in rapid skirmishes, keeping them occupied and distracted. On the right, Hasdrubal led the heavier cavalry against the Roman equites with brutal efficiency, scattering them after a swift and decisive engagement. Once the Roman cavalry was routed, the Carthaginian riders regrouped and wheeled inward, galloping behind the enemy lines, encircling the Roman infantry from the rear. At that moment, the Libyan infantry on the flanks pivoted inward, forming a solid wall on either side of the increasingly compressed Roman advance. The Roman soldiers, now deep inside the hollow of Hannibal's design, found themselves struck on three sides. Their formation, too dense for maneuver, became a prison. The Carthaginian infantry pressed in, the cavalry closed from behind, and the Romans, pinned in, were slaughtered not in combat, but in confinement. Blades rose and fell with mechanical precision. Men died standing, unable to raise arms in their defense. For hours, the massacre continued. The Roman army could neither retreat nor reorganize. Bodies piled upon bodies. Blood turned dust to paste. By the end of the day, over 50,000 Roman soldiers were dead, nearly two-thirds of the entire force. Another 10,000 were captured. Only a few thousand escaped. Among the slain were senators, consular officers, and high-ranking officials, the beating heart of Rome's military and political structure gutted in a single day. Cannae was not merely a victory, it was annihilation. A battle that would be studied for centuries as the pinnacle of tactical brilliance, as Hannibal used a smaller, more agile force to destroy a vastly superior enemy by exploiting psychology, terrain, and rigid Roman doctrine. It marked the height of Hannibal's power, the zenith of Carthaginian presence in Italy. But the gates of Rome did not fall. Hannibal, though urged by his commanders to march directly on the capital, held back. He understood the strength of Roman fortifications, the depth of its manpower reserves, and the necessity of further weakening its alliances before attempting siege. It was a decision that would haunt military theorists for generations. Cannae had shattered Rome's army, but not its resolve. The Republic would retreat into desperation and caution, yet it would not yield. Not yet. The fields of Cannae, littered with Roman dead, whispered the greatness of one man's vision. But greatness alone could not topple a nation that refused to die. After the slaughter at Cannae, the Italian peninsula trembled beneath the weight of its own uncertainty. Rome stood in silence for days, mourning the dead, searching for names among the fallen, trying to measure the scale of what had been lost. Senators debated within the Curia while the streets filled with fear. Yet even as the Republic bled, it did not collapse. No negotiations were sent to Hannibal. No plea for peace. Instead, the Senate declared the state of the Republic more secure than ever, executed those who spoke of surrender, and ordered the raising of new legions, even from boys and slaves. Hannibal, undefeated in battle, remained a commander without a decisive political victory. The Italian allies of Rome wavered, but did not desert en masse. Some southern cities like Capua defected, and others in Apulia and Samnium offered support, but the core of Roman allegiance, Latium, Etruria, and central Italy, remained loyal. Hannibal moved freely in the south, but each step deeper into the peninsula became harder. Rome refused battle, refusing to give him another opportunity like Cannae. Fabius Maximus' strategy of attrition returned. Hannibal found himself the master of open terrain, but a prisoner of logistics, distance, and isolation. His requests for reinforcements from Carthage were met with hesitation. The Senate at home hesitated to commit resources, cautious and mistrustful of a general growing too powerful on foreign soil. Hanno and his political faction undermined support for the Barcid family. Despite the magnitude of Hannibal's accomplishments, Carthage failed to match his ambitions with strategic backing. Reinforcements trickled instead of surged. The war in Iberia consumed resources that could have tipped the balance in Italy. In time, Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, would attempt to come to his aid, but they would arrive too late or be defeated before joining him. Over the next decade, Hannibal campaigned tirelessly. He wintered in Capua, fought battles in Lucania and Apulia, laid siege to towns, and defended against Roman counterattacks. But the war changed. Rome adapted. New generals rose. Men who had studied Hannibal's tactics, endured his traps, and learned to counter them. The strategy shifted from headlong confrontation to gradual erosion. Roman forces retook cities, wore down Carthaginian allies, and slowly reclaimed the Italian interior. Hannibal never suffered a catastrophic defeat in Italy, but he began to lose the war through exhaustion and detachment. The decisive shift came not in Italy, but in Africa. Scipio, son of the wounded consul of Ticinus, matured into a commander of equal brilliance. Victorious in Iberia, he carried the war to Carthage's own soil. Rome, for all its losses, remained capable of projecting power across the Mediterranean. Faced with the threat to their homeland, the Carthaginian council finally recalled Hannibal. After more than 15 years in Italy, he sailed back across the sea, away from the mountains he had crossed, the rivers he had turned red, and the fields where he had made history. At Zama in 202 BCE, Hannibal and Scipio met in a final clash of titans. There, on the open plains of North Africa, the younger Roman general outmaneuvered the older Carthaginian master. Hannibal's elephants panicked. His lines broke. His long campaign ended not in triumph, but in defeat. Carthage was forced to accept Rome's terms, and the Second Punic War came to an end. Hannibal returned to Carthage not as a disgrace, but as a figure of awe and burden. He entered politics, reformed the Carthaginian state, and worked to restore its strength. But Rome, fearing his mind more than his sword, pursued him even in peace. Driven into exile, he wandered among eastern courts, still scheming, still calculating. His final years were spent far from the land he had shaken, until, hunted and cornered, he took his own life rather than fall into Roman hands. Yet his story endured. Hannibal's march over the Alps became legend, not because of what it achieved, but because of what it revealed. It exposed the vulnerabilities of an empire, the potential of individual genius, and the terrible price of unyielding ambition. He had crossed mountains once thought impassable, bent nations to his will, and reshaped warfare with intellect rather than numbers. Though Carthage would fall, and Rome would rise to dominate the ancient world, Hannibal's legacy would echo through the centuries. He had come from the sea and passed over the sky's roof to stand at the gates of Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a ghost that would haunt its history forever. The age of conquest, carved in blood and ambition, knew no borders. Long after Hannibal's elephants had crossed the Alps and vanished into memory, the echoes of empire rumbled in distant lands. Across deserts and seas, beyond the western reach of Roman ambition, another world stirred with power. In the Indian subcontinent, where the Ganges flowed like a silver thread through a quilt of kingdoms, another kind of war had been waged, a war not only for territory, but for the soul of a man. Here, where thick forests cloaked the land and the monsoon carved the hills into rivers of mud and life, the Mauryan Empire had risen like a colossus. Founded by Chandragupta, expanded by Bindusara, and ruled with absolute authority. It stretched from the snow-fed valleys of the Himalayas to the scorching edges of the southern seas. At its helm now stood Ashoka, a man born into privilege but forged in iron. In him stirred a fire that mirrored that of Hannibal, a relentless drive, a calculated mind, and a belief in the necessity of domination. Yet, while Hannibal's legacy had been shaped by defiance and tragedy, Ashoka's would be reshaped by something rarer: regret. Ashoka's early years had been steeped in conflict. The son of an emperor and the grandson of a conqueror, he was raised amid the doctrine of expansion and rule. His mind was sharpened by philosophy and administration, his hands by warfare and suppression. He had quelled rebellions, seized fortresses, and stood triumphant over broken armies. The empire he inherited was vast, yet to him it seemed incomplete. A single region along the eastern coast refused subjugation. Kalinga, proud, independent, and defiant, stood like a stone in the Mauryan tide. Situated between the rivers and the sea, rich in trade and culture, Kalinga was no minor prize. Its ports fed the lifeblood of commerce to far-off lands. Its people, fiercely autonomous, had resisted Mauryan encroachment for decades. To Ashoka, their independence was intolerable. To command all of India, he believed, one must first bring Kalinga to its knees. Thus, he ordered the march. The army that descended upon Kalinga was among the greatest ever assembled in Indian history. War elephants, their tusks armored and painted, led the charge. Infantry in disciplined ranks, archers with bows taller than themselves, and cavalry thundered down from the plains. The battle was not a single engagement, but a campaign of encirclement and attrition. Towns were razed, defenders slaughtered, civilians enslaved. The resistance was brave, but futile. In the aftermath, the numbers defied belief. More than 100,000 lay dead. Tens of thousands were captured, chained, or marched from their homes. The rivers ran red for days, and the fields, once fertile, were churned to mud and ash. Ashoka stood among the ruins, crowned not by joy, but by a heavy silence. The price of conquest, so long buried beneath glory and banners, stood before him, undeniable, unending. There, among the corpses and the weeping, something within Ashoka cracked. Not with fury, but with stillness. He did not weep, nor shout, nor cast blame. He observed. He walked the remains of what had once been a proud city. He watched mothers bury children, old men gaze silently into fire-blackened ruins, and his own soldiers carry away spoils without triumph in their eyes. The cost was his, and the empire's, and it could not be paid in coin or praise. It was in that moment, not of war, but of awakening, that the man who had been an emperor of force began to consider another path. The swords were not yet sheathed. The empire still burned with ambition. But Ashoka's mind turned inward, seeking meaning beyond dominion. The blood of Kalinga would not be forgotten. It would be remembered not as a victory, but as a wound. After the fires of Kalinga died down, the empire returned to a deceptive calm. The soldiers withdrew, the banners were folded, and emissaries proclaimed victory across the land. Yet in the heart of the victor, nothing remained unburned. Ashoka, once animated by strategy and strength, now moved through his palace halls like a shadow. The rituals of kingship continued. Advisors approached with scrolls, generals reported with pride, and courtiers celebrated the conquest. But the emperor did not respond with joy. He sat in silence, listening not to voices around him, but to the ones he could not quiet within. Each day brought memories of the campaign, of screams rising through smoke, of eyes wide with terror, of men begging not for mercy, but for meaning. The ghosts of Kalinga did not speak. They lingered in the corners of his chambers, in the stillness after nightfall, in the quiet moments between decrees. He did not speak of them, but they shaped every thought. The weight of conquest, once a crown, had become a chain. Ashoka turned from pageantry to introspection. He withdrew from the court for long periods, cloistered in gardens, wandering alone through temple courtyards and wooded retreats. He no longer ordered fortifications, but requested scriptures. He no longer asked for reports of new provinces, but for the words of sages. The advisors whispered among themselves. Was the emperor ill? Had the strain of war broken his mind? But Ashoka did not falter in his duties. He signed laws, mediated disputes, and reviewed infrastructure projects. Yet beneath it all, his spirit had shifted. He now sought not dominion, but understanding. In the monasteries of Magadha and the sacred sites near the Ganges, Ashoka began to encounter teachings that resonated with the pain within him. The words of the Buddha, spoken centuries earlier, reached him not as distant philosophy, but as a balm to the wounds no physician could treat. The truths of impermanence, suffering, and the path to liberation echoed with the force of revelation. The man who had conquered cities now saw the futility in conquering others while remaining enslaved to his own torment. He did not convert through ritual or decree. His transformation was gradual, shaped by solitude, study, and the disintegration of old certainties. He read the Dhamma not as a ruler seeking doctrine, but as a man desperate for peace. The principles of compassion, restraint, nonviolence, and universal welfare offered him not just a new ideology, but a new identity. He began to adopt its tenets not by proclamation, but by action. Royal hunts ceased. Orders were given to stop unnecessary slaughter. Prisoners were released or given fair trials. Hospitals were funded, not for generals, but for all beings, including animals. Ashoka's questions changed from how do we expand to how do we heal, from what must be subdued to what must be understood. The empire watched with uncertainty. The soldiers sharpened blades that would not be used. The court poets waited for triumphs that would not be celebrated. And yet, slowly, something else took shape. Ashoka, still crowned, still powerful, began to govern not through fear, but through the force of example. He listened to grievances personally. He walked among the poor. He questioned his own judgments. The emperor had not vanished. He had turned. What began in the bloodied soil of Kalinga had taken root in silence. The path ahead was unclear, but the direction had changed. Ashoka no longer ruled for glory. He now sought redemption, not in the eyes of the world, but in the depths of his own being. The Mauryan Empire, vast and layered like the forests of the Deccan, had been built on conquest. Its roads bore the footprints of armies, its borders held by garrisons and tribute. But under Ashoka's transformed gaze, that structure began to evolve. No longer a machine of control alone, the empire started to become a vessel for something unprecedented: moral governance. The emperor, who once conquered through sword and siege, now sought to conquer hearts and minds through the teachings of the Dhamma. The word spread first through policy. Taxation became tempered with fairness. Royal officers were instructed to show kindness, not domination. The use of torture was curtailed. Mercy, once considered weakness, became an arm of justice. But Ashoka understood that transformation could not live only in orders passed through scribes. Ideas must be seen, touched, read by all, by merchants on dusty roads, by villagers tending fields, by nobles in ivory halls. So he ordered something new. All across the empire, from the rocky plateaus of Karnataka to the borders of Kashmir, from the shores of the eastern coast to the western deserts, workers began to carve messages into stone. These were not statues of victory or steels of conquest. They were edicts, stone-carved reflections of Ashoka's evolving soul. Written in the local languages, etched in Brahmi and Kharosthi scripts, they bore simple yet profound words: reverence for life, duty to family, honesty, compassion, restraint, tolerance. The edicts were placed along trade routes, near city gates, outside temples, beside wells, in the heart of wilderness. They stood as silent sentinels of a new order. For the first time, governance did not hide behind palace walls or divine rights. It stood in the open, offered to all. Travelers paused to read. Villagers touched the stone with reverence. Pilgrims wept. Children repeated the words aloud. The emperor was speaking not only to his ministers, but to the soul of the land itself. Ashoka's Dhamma was not sectarian. Though drawn from Buddhist ethics, it embraced universality. He encouraged respect among all religious traditions, Brahmanical, Jain, Ajivika, and beyond. He did not demand conversion. He demanded reflection. His goal was not uniformity of belief, but harmony of conduct. Under this new doctrine, virtue was no longer confined to ascetics and priests. It became the duty of farmers, soldiers, and kings alike. The bureaucratic machinery of the empire shifted accordingly. A new class of officers, the Dhamma Mahamatras, was created. Their role was not to collect tribute or enforce law, but to monitor moral welfare, mediate between communities, aid the poor, and encourage ethical behavior. These officials traveled tirelessly, reporting not on rebellion, but on kindness. The empire was still governed, but it breathed differently now. Ashoka did not cease being an emperor. He maintained order, managed roads and irrigation, protected trade, and responded to threats. But his mind moved with different rhythms. He meditated in groves where once he had planned campaigns. He sent envoys not only with gold and gifts, but with texts and scrolls. The empire's frontiers were no longer just defended. They were extended through goodwill. Beneath the throne, the memory of Kalinga remained. It did not fade. It was not forgotten. It was the root beneath the tree of change. In place of statues of triumph, Ashoka commissioned pillars inscribed with regret, with intention, with resolve. The Dhamma did not erase the past. It transformed it into purpose. The stone edicts multiplied. From jagged hills to market towns, they spread like seeds on wind. And with each carving, Ashoka's voice reached farther, softer than any trumpet, stronger than any army. As the years passed, Ashoka's vision grew beyond the borders of his empire. The Dhamma, once a personal transformation born from guilt and grief, became a state philosophy radiating outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The Mauryan Empire, held together by roads, officials, and tribute, now became a conduit for something deeper, a message of ethical living, of restraint and victory, of harmony without domination. Ashoka's reach extended not through iron, but through intention. Embassies were sent to distant lands, not with threats or demands, but with scrolls, relics, and words. From the capital at Pataliputra, envoys traveled westward across the Hindu Kush, beyond the jagged spine of Central Asia, into the Hellenistic courts of the Seleucids and Ptolemies. They carried letters composed with humility and moral invitation, addressed to kings who knew nothing of Kalinga, but everything of conquest. Ashoka did not seek alliances. He sought understanding. To the south, emissaries crossed the seas to Lanka. In the shadow of coconut palms and temple groves, they brought teachings, sacred texts, and monks trained in compassion rather than command. The island kingdom, moved by the message, embraced the Dhamma not as submission, but as awakening. Temples rose, not in honor of the emperor, but in honor of peace. From Lanka, the message would sail farther, toward golden lands beyond the ocean. Within the empire, the changes deepened. Trees were planted along roads to give shade to travelers. Wells were dug where none had existed before. Hospitals, both for humans and animals, were funded and maintained. Slavery was discouraged. Capital punishment was limited. The judiciary was urged to offer second chances, not permanent condemnation. Laws were revised not merely for control, but for fairness. Ashoka still ruled, but he ruled as a servant to a greater principle. His inscriptions bore no boast of lineage or divine birth. They offered instead the voice of a man attempting to do right, acknowledging his failures, urging others to avoid his path. He referred to himself not as a divine being, but as Devanampiya Payadasi, the beloved of the gods, the one who looks with affection. These were not titles of conquest, but of conscience. Not all accepted as changes. Some in the military whispered of weakness. Some in the court resented the elevation of monks and moral officials. The engine of empire resisted slowing. But Ashoka, though gentle in speech, was resolute in purpose. He did not disband his armies, but he refused to send them into wars of expansion. He allowed debate, but discouraged aggression. He did not suppress other faiths, but insisted they coexist in mutual respect. The Dhamma was not a creed. It was a lens through which power, privilege, and justice were to be re-examined. As the edicts multiplied, they became not only messages but monuments. They marked roads, rivers, mountain passes, borders. They greeted travelers, reminded judges, warned tax collectors, and comforted the grieving. They were written not only in Prakrit, but in Greek and Aramaic, for the people at the fringes of the empire who spoke those tongues. Ashoka's voice became many-voiced, carved into the living bones of the earth. He no longer sought immortality through temples or tombs. He sought it in the transformation of those who read his words, in the tears prevented, in the lives spared, in the moments of mercy chosen over wrath. Ashoka had begun his reign with blood, but now he moved through the world like wind over grass, present, felt, but no longer cutting. The earth beneath him bore scars, but his footsteps now pressed gently, leaving not wounds, but echoes. While the outer face of the empire changed with laws, edicts, and reform, Ashoka's inner transformation deepened into quiet intensity. No longer did he seek greatness through victory or dominion. He turned inward, not in retreat, but in search of clarity. In the courtyards of stone temples and under the canopy of Bodhi trees, he listened to the words of monks, read the sutras of ancient seers, and sat alone in stillness. The emperor who once gave commands now sought silence. Meditation became his ritual, not the performance of royalty, but the sincere discipline of a man seeking understanding beyond politics. His thoughts returned again and again to suffering, not only of those lost in Kalinga, but of all who lived under his rule. He saw pain in farmers broken by drought, in prisoners abandoned by justice, in animals butchered without purpose. He did not see these as isolated tragedies. He saw them as consequences of blindness, of unchecked power, of systems built without compassion. So Ashoka refined the Dhamma further. He instructed his officials to visit rural villages, not to collect taxes, but to learn what was needed. He sent his Dhamma Mahamatras to converse with the sick, the elderly, and the neglected. He demanded reports not on productivity, but on suffering. He funded shelters, extended rest houses along pilgrimage routes, and ordered the planting of medicinal gardens. Acts once reserved for nobles or cities were made universal. Compassion, once a private virtue, became public policy. He also re-examined the empire's festivals and rituals. Blood sacrifices, once performed with state sponsorship, were discouraged or replaced with symbolic offerings. Public spectacles of violence gave way to gatherings where moral stories were recited. Ashoka believed that entertainment shaped the soul of the people. If cruelty was made sport, cruelty would be made normal. He chose differently, and the empire, slowly, responded. Yet not all welcomed this shift. In military ranks, discontent simmered. Generals accustomed to glory saw their legions idle. Nobles who thrived on war profits whispered that the emperor had grown soft. Religious conservatives grumbled about favoritism toward Buddhism, despite his proclamations of tolerance. But Ashoka did not react with suppression. He responded with steadiness. He invited critics to speak, addressed their fears, and refused to return to the methods he had renounced. Power, he now believed, must bend to principle. Even his personal life transformed. He simplified his wardrobe, walked among citizens unannounced, and relinquished certain luxuries. He treated servants as companions, listened to their stories, and honored their humanity. He asked not to be worshipped, but understood. For Ashoka, redemption did not lie in penance alone. It lay in the day-to-day practice of conscience, by a king, by a farmer, by all. In time, the people began to sense the difference. Their ruler was not aloof, but attentive. The empire was no utopia, but it now pulsed with care. Governance had not become weak, it had become aware. And though the scars of Kalinga would never fade, they no longer defined the empire. They had become its root, its turning point, its quiet vow. Ashoka's face appeared on coins and seals, but his true legacy lived in the choices reshaping daily life. Not in monuments, but in a mother receiving aid. Not in temples, but in the prisoner offered dignity. Not in conquest, but in restraint. He had found a different path. It was not wide. It was not easy, but it led, step by step, toward peace. As the empire settled into this new rhythm, the transformation of Ashoka's rule began to be felt beyond policies and proclamations. It became embedded in the moral atmosphere of the land. Temples rang less with the clash of debate and more with the chanting of unity. The Dharma, once spoken only in monasteries and forest retreats, now pulsed through the arteries of statecraft. And Ashoka, no longer a ruler of fear, became a figure of moral aspiration. He commissioned stupas not as symbols of dominance, but as beacons of reverence. He restored sacred sites associated with the Buddha, marking the places of birth, enlightenment, first teaching, and passing. Pilgrims began to journey across the empire, tracing these paths, inspired not by decree but by devotion. Ashoka ordered rest houses and wells to be built along these routes, recognizing that spiritual movement must be sustained by physical care. He also expanded the Sangha, the monastic community, by encouraging the ordination of new monks and nuns. These were not secluded ascetics, but wandering teachers, tasked with spreading Dharma among the people. They were supported by the state, but not controlled by it. Their autonomy was protected, their teachings respected, even when they critiqued the government. Ashoka did not silence them. He welcomed them. He believed that truth could not be shaped by power, it must remain above it. Internationally, the emperor's Dharma diplomacy continued. Inscriptions speak of emissaries sent not only to Lanka, but to regions now known as Syria, Egypt, Greece, and possibly even further east. Though the cultural and political impact of these missions was uncertain, the intent was clear. Ashoka saw no border to compassion. His messages, carved in stone and carried by voice, asked kings and citizens alike to reflect on the cost of cruelty, the value of restraint, the necessity of moral leadership. At home, his edicts turned increasingly introspective. In some, he confessed the difficulty of living by the Dharma. He admitted the challenge of aligning intention with action, of leading without attachment. These were not boasts, but reflections. The ruler who once declared victories now carved his doubts into stone. This humility made his legacy endure. He presented not perfection, but struggle, not divine wisdom, but human awakening. In some of the later edicts, he began to emphasize harmony among all religions, urging mutual respect and avoidance of arrogance. He recognized the poison of sectarian pride, the danger of mistaking ritual for righteousness. He advocated for patience in dialogue, gentleness in disagreement. His empire, vast and diverse, could not be united by creed. It could be united only by a shared ethic of care. Yet even as his reforms deepened, Ashoka remained aware of impermanence. He saw empires rise and fall, cities built and buried, kings remembered and forgotten. He began to teach that legacy was not measured in monuments or borders, but in actions that reduced suffering. The Dharma, to him, was not a monument to be guarded. It was a wheel meant to turn again and again through the lives of those who chose the path of understanding. Toward the end of this period, he ordered the construction of his most enduring symbols, the stone pillars crowned with lions, guardians of truth. These pillars, rising from forest, field, and city gate, did not point upward to heaven. They stood rooted in earth, facing the people. They bore no threats, only guidance. They asked no worship, only reflection. Ashoka had turned the machinery of empire toward ethical renewal. And those storms would one day return. Though the dynasty would fade, these pillars would stand. They bore no sword, no crown, only words. Yet through those words, a new kind of power moved across the land. In the years following the widespread spread of edicts and reforms, Ashoka's inner journey reached a deeper stillness. No longer driven by urgency, he moved with a deliberate calm that marked every gesture of his rule. He had not abandoned the responsibilities of emperor. He still met with ministers, heard petitions, reviewed the workings of his sprawling bureaucracy, but his mind had taken firm root in something beyond the cycles of statecraft. The empire functioned. The soul of the emperor wandered further inward. He began to make pilgrimages to places sacred to the Buddha's life. These were not acts of royal display. They were quiet, personal acknowledgments of a path once walked by a man who had also turned from power to wisdom. At Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, Ashoka erected a stone inscription affirming its sanctity and granting it exemption from taxation. At Bodh Gaya, where the tree stood beneath which the Buddha had attained enlightenment, he sat in stillness, listening not to monks, but to the wind moving through its leaves. No guards announced his presence. No trumpets declared his visit. He was not a conqueror there, but a student of silence. These journeys became a rhythm to his reign. From Sarnath, where the first teachings were delivered, to Kushinagar, where the Buddha passed away, Ashoka's footsteps retraced a life that had illuminated his own. He ordered the restoration of these sites, but not in grandiose fashion. Stone railings, carved lotus thrones, simple shrines. Beauty without opulence. devotion without spectacle. He also sought to embody the Dharma not only in policy, but in personal life. He gave up the pleasures of the court. His meals were taken in simplicity. His interactions with servants became warmer, more equal. He acknowledged past cruelties not as mistakes to be hidden, but as lessons to be taught. In his own writings, he warned future rulers not to be seduced by ambition, not to confuse victory with virtue. His was no passive reign. It was an active moral dialogue with himself, with his people, with history. Ashoka's attention turned increasingly toward education and preservation. He funded schools where ethical conduct was taught alongside statecraft. He encouraged debate between sects, not to determine superiority, but to deepen understanding. He believed that right knowledge led to right action, and that ignorance, especially among the powerful, was the seed of suffering. The influence of his Dharma widened. In villages once ignored by imperial officials, children began to learn verses of compassion. Traders traveling between cities found sanctuaries where rest was offered freely. Farmers began planting trees not for profit, but for shade and nourishment. The change was not uniform, nor immediate, but it spread like roots beneath the surface, unseen yet persistent. Even as he aged, Ashoka did not retreat from responsibility. He continued to send letters to governors, instructing them not in taxation quotas, but in how to treat their subjects justly. He reminded them that power must always kneel before ethics. His edicts grew more personal, more reflective, often bearing a tone of one who knows his time is passing. He urged those who read them to look beyond stone, beyond kings, and find their own path to righteousness. The emperor who had once stood ankle-deep in the blood of Kalinga now walked barefoot beneath Bodhi branches. The man who had wielded armies now chose the stillness of shade. His legacy no longer rode on horseback. It walked slowly, barefoot, carrying only words. The final years of Ashoka's reign unfolded not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve. Age crept into his bones. His steps grew slower, his voice softer, but his mind remained clear. He had become a fixture not only of government, but of moral imagination. To many, he was no longer just a king. He was a presence, a figure that stood not above the people, but beside them, guiding not by decree, but by example. In these years, his thoughts turned increasingly toward permanence, not of empire, but of principle. He understood that buildings crumble, armies dissolve, dynasties vanish. What could remain was conduct, not the laws themselves, but the habits they shaped. Not the edicts as stone, but the edicts as voice, transmitted from teacher to pupil, from elder to child, from act to echo. To preserve that voice, Ashoka ordered a final round of inscriptions, the most personal and universal yet. Carved into cave walls and on monolithic pillars, these later edicts bore no accounts of victories, no genealogies, no boasts. They recorded a philosophy refined through remorse, forged through practice, offered to a future he would never see. These were the legacy he had chosen, words rather than weapons. He spoke of the difficulty of doing good, of the challenges of self-restraint, of the temptation to return to old patterns of domination. He admitted his imperfections. He described his efforts to live by the Dharma not as completed tasks, but as ongoing efforts. This vulnerability did not diminish his stature, it deepened it. He no longer spoke as one who ruled, but as one who served a higher purpose. The empire around him remained strong, but signs of change began to appear. Younger governors grew impatient with idealism. Military leaders voiced concerns over defensiveness. Some regional administrators, outside the emperor's immediate reach, began to ignore the moral directives and revert to older methods of rule. Ashoka knew that time eroded even the noblest intentions. Yet he did not despair. He had planted seeds, and seeds do not sprout in every soil. But some take root. He began mentoring his descendants and ministers, not with strategy, but with wisdom. He instructed them not to emulate his conquest, but his correction. He reminded them that kings are measured not by territory, but by the suffering they reduce. He understood that the world would change after him. He hoped only that it would remember what had been possible when compassion had ruled. His last public works focused not on expanding influence, but on deepening roots. He supported the preservation of Buddhist texts. He aided the translation of teachings into other tongues. He encouraged spiritual exchange with distant regions. He saw himself not as a guardian of doctrine, but as a gardener of understanding. Even in decline, his purpose sharpened, to leave behind a world less cruel than the one he had once commanded. Ashoka did not claim enlightenment. He did not ascend into myth. He aged like any man, graying, thinning, weakening. But his soul remained steady. He knew that he would die not as the emperor who conquered Kalinga, but as the one who had been changed by it. The fields of that once bloodied land now grew crops in peace. The rivers that had run red now flowed clear. In his final season, Ashoka looked not toward expansion or legacy, but toward stillness. He had built roads for armies and travelers. Now he followed one within. The horizon he watched was no longer geographical. It was inward, a quiet edge beyond which power dissolved, and only the truth remained. The sun never sets all at once on an empire. It fades slowly, filtered through generations and decisions, long after its architects are gone. In the final year of Ashoka's life, the Mauryan Empire still stretched across the subcontinent, its roads intact, its cities alive, its officials in place. But beneath the surface, small fractures had begun to appear, signs not of failure, but of transition. Ashoka, now frail and stooped, spent less time in the palace and more in meditation. He no longer presided over grand audiences. Instead, he summoned scholars and monks to quiet discussions. His words were measured, his tone reflective. He asked not for reports of tribute or security, but for stories of suffering, acts of kindness, and moments of moral clarity. He was no longer shaping an empire. He was preparing to leave one behind. In these final months, Ashoka composed his most intimate edicts, simple messages etched into stone near places of rest and reflection. They spoke of impermanence, of the difficulty of guiding others, of the loneliness of power. He addressed future rulers not as a sovereign, but as a witness to change. He warned them of arrogance. He urged them to walk slowly, to listen deeply, to rule with softness even when the world demanded steel. He entrusted no heir with his full burden. The empire would pass to his descendants, but the Dharma was not theirs to inherit. It was theirs to rediscover, as he had. Ashoka did not attempt to control the future. He knew that every age brings its own dilemmas, its own needs. His task had not been to impose a lasting order. It had been to show that another way was possible. Around him, life continued with quiet dignity. Pilgrims visited the places he had marked. Farmers tilled the earth in regions once scorched by war. Monks traveled from village to village, reciting verses and offering counsel. The empire pulsed with his influence, not as force, but as memory. Not all followed the Dharma. Not all understood it. But it had changed the atmosphere of power. It had carved a new channel in the bedrock of kingship. Ashoka's final days were not marked by illness or drama. They passed like the end of a long journey, calm, quiet, expectant. He asked to be taken to a grove near a stone pillar he had once raised. There he sat, not as emperor, but as one more traveler. The edict beside him bore no threats, no claims of glory. It spoke only of humility, of care for all beings, of the impermanence of wealth and title. He died without ceremony. No great battle marked his passing. No temple captured his essence. The man who had once commanded an army large enough to sweep across the continent now left the world with nothing but stone, memory, and example. But those would prove more enduring than conquest. His body was returned to the capital. Cremation was simple, by his request. Ashes were divided and distributed, not hoarded. No pyramid, no fortress, no golden tomb was built in his name. Instead, the wind carried his name along trade routes. The rivers whispered it in still waters, and the stones repeated it with each touch of hand and eye. The emperor who had turned from war to wisdom left behind an India still vast, still flawed, but more conscious than before. His life had not erased suffering, but it had shifted the question from how to rule to why. Long after Ashoka's ashes mingled with the soil of the Ganges basin, the empire he ruled continued to move forward, first under his successors, then slowly into decline. Dynasties shifted, capitals changed, maps redrew themselves again and again. But something remained embedded deeper than marble or mortar. Something survived not in the palaces of Pataliputra, but in the scattered, weathered stone. Ashoka's edicts, carved into cliffs, pillars, and cave walls, endured wind, rain, and time. Some were buried. Others were forgotten, half erased by lichen and silence. But they did not vanish. Farmers stumbled upon them centuries later. Monks brushed off dust. Scholars puzzled over their strange script. And in time, the voice of Ashoka returned, soft, steady, distant yet intimate. Through these words, his life spoke again, not of empire, but of ethical striving, not of triumph, but of change. He had left behind not just a record of deeds, but a confession, a reflection, a moral inheritance. His story, unlike those of many rulers, did not end in conquest. It ended in transformation. Ashoka's greatest act had not been the forging of a vast domain, nor the suppression of rebellion. It had been the conquest of himself. In a world that rewarded dominance, he had turned toward gentleness. In an age of swords, he had chosen the word. In a culture of lineage, he had made his legacy not bloodline, but insight. Buddhism, once a regional tradition, spread across Asia in part because of his support. From Sri Lanka to China, from Central Asia to Japan, his memory appeared in temple carvings, in monastic chronicles, in pilgrim routes. His lion capital, once standing over a pillar in Sarnath, would one day become the emblem of a modern republic. His Dharma wheel, once chiseled by stonemasons under imperial order, would turn again on the flag of an independent India. And yet, beyond symbols, his truest contribution lived quietly, in governance shaped by compassion, in the expectation that rulers could be humble, that laws could serve life rather than power, that remorse could lead not to paralysis but to renewal. Few rulers followed his example fully. Many forgot it. But the possibility he revealed, that power could be wielded not as domination, but as service, remained lodged in the collective memory of a civilization. In history, Ashoka's life formed a rare arc. It did not end where it began. It was not a spiral of repeated violence. It was a line that turned, and in turning, illuminated something larger than its own ambition. It stood as proof that remorse could be more than regret, that it could become fuel for wisdom, for governance, for peace. The fields of Kalinga, once soaked with blood, grew quiet. The pillars of Ashoka, once polished and newly carved, weathered into the color of earth. But the message they bore, of restraint, of tolerance, of empathy, remained etched not only in stone, but in the imagination of those who still looked for other ways to lead, other ways to live. Ashoka Maurya, the emperor who became a seeker, had built no great pyramid, no eternal flame. He left behind only questions, carved in rock. How do we live rightly? How do we use power without harming? What remains when conquest fades? The answers still echo, faintly, in stone, waiting to be read again.